We're going to talk now about St. Louis and the Tactician Archers. So, who is really St. Louis replacing in the Tactician Archers? Number one, the answer there for sure is going to be Suleiman, right? But the game is recommending for you to use this build. You can actually see that if you go through the tutorial. You can see that your game actually suggests this build. Okay, so this build is a debuffs and archers. So for St. Louis, it is true that it's a debuff for the archers. Now the only thing here is that after testing or having several tests on this one, the best way to really get the value of this heroes right here is to really just use the commander skills and have like an AoE damage plus the incapacitation for your heroes. But before we continue with that explanation, it's better for me to introduce to you St. Louis with his skills. So we have here his commander skill, Sacred Crusade. So commander skills damage strategy up to 3 enemy in a fan shape area. Now the damage rate is at 330% with a strategy bonus and has a 30% chance to actually inflict incapacitation. Now what is incapacitation? Incapacitation is incapacitating heroes and deals that these heroes cannot really deal any damage. So after the effect ends, they cannot be incapacitated again for 3 seconds. So this actually can help you guys out in the troops because if your opponent is actually incapacitated, you will have a huge advantage, especially if you have incapacitated multiple heroes in the for example in the battlefield. You have incapacitated multiple heroes and you will help your other troops or your other alliance members into defeating them. That is going to be a huge additional gain for your alliance. And also, since this is an area of effects, so 3 enemies at max will be a pretty huge also thing for your troops. Now also, he has the Sovereign's Decree signature skill. Now this is an active skill, alright? Active skill with a 35% chance of activation. This one deals strategy damage to your enemy troops. Now the damage rate is around 240%, plus you have the strategy bonus. If your enemy unit falls below 85%, which is I think the only downside of this skill, this increases this skill's damage by 20%. You will really have a little bit of hard time on the first instance of the fight. Although once you get that 85% health from your enemy, you will have 260% overall damage, which is pretty decent, I think. So it's pretty okay. So St. Louis damage increased by 15% strategy bonus. When St. Louis serves as the commander, your troop's next hero to act deals 10% additional damage, and with strategy bonus. When your troops' health falls below 70%, when your troops falls below 70%, reduces damage taken by 15%, which is going to be good, especially if you are an archer in the field. Now, another thing here is that you need to think who is going to be your second in command if you are using your St. Louis. So for the archers, if you are using Suleiman as the second in command, yes, it would work for the 10%. The only problem with that march is actually activation chances. Because your Suleiman also has an active skill that also has like the same activation chance. So sometimes the RNG really isn't good with skills, and sometimes you are being damaged or you are damaged by other players before you can really activate so much. But I'm not saying that this is really bad. I'm just saying that it's pretty decent. But as I've said, your commander skill really will be your strength for your St. Louis, and these skills does slaps. Now for the customizable skills, we have Sacred Flame Judgment. Now this is also another active skill. So you have an active skill, activation chance of 35% also. This one deals strategy damage to the enemy troops with a damage rate of 220%. Now this also has a strategy bonus. When the enemy unit falls below 50%, you will deal extra damage instance of strategy damage. Now the damage rate is at 180%. And the strategy bonus, so that's actually pretty good. We have also another one here for the slot, but for me, you want your strategy master's gift because of the damage, plus it really helps with the activation chances. you really need activation for this one to work. So that's actually, I think, the best way to use this March. Now let's read the stars so that we could know if you can use him as a free-to-play player or low spender. Now for the first star, the Sovereign's degree damage rate increases by extra 20%. So all of us can get him to first star for sure. And this skill triggers an additional 5% damage increase. Now for the third star, when your enemy falls below 85%, triggers the skill damage increase effect of Sovereign's Decree. Your damage is increased by additional 5% plus strategy bonus. And the next hero to act deals 5% extra damage. That's why you completed the 10%. Now here is the thing. If you're a 5-star St. Louis, this increases the Sovereign's Decree's trigger chance by 5%. Also reduces damage taken by your troop by 15% when the troop falls below 70%. Now the question is this a must have for this hero? I think if you are a low spender to mid spender or maybe a free to play, you can go get him to just 3 stars. And if you are a Tactician Archer user, but I only know like a handful Tactician Archer users in the game. And honestly speaking, most of them are main or using really the Tactician Archers as their main. So it's safe to say they will most likely get to 5 stars. Another one is that if this hero right here, St. Louis, is going to be paired up with a Suleiman, as I've said earlier, I think I already mentioned it, the activation of Suleiman is pretty low. It's going to be pretty hard for you to actually deal damage before you hit the 85% of your enemy so that you can get the extra 20%, and bringing down your enemy to 50% is actually going to be a little bit really harder that way. So for me, this is a viable March with Confucius also. So Confucius here is the healer and the tanker. So with this March, I think you need a burst on the first few seconds, or maybe a super tanky March in order for this March to work. So for the rings, if you're going to use this to compensate for the loss of what I mean is what I've said is going to be a really hard fought battle with this March, what you really need is another source of damage. Now you can use an Azure Moon Ring here, which is, I think, pretty much a good additional damage here. And then in here, I think you need the Everflamewing rings. That's why I think for low spenders, it's going to be, or free-to-play players, it's going to be really hard if this is not your main troops, because you need such ring. You can actually compensate for this Everflamewing rings if you don't have this with the mount adornments. So with the mount adornments, there are adornments for archers there that can actually give you silence or burn effect without using the Everflamewing rings. That is why this is also viable for free-to-play or low spenders alike. But this is the high tier rings that I can actually give you guys. Now I would rather get a Tranquil Water ring here, because for me, based on my experience and based on the skills of Confucius, your Confucius is best after he uses all, or he activated the stacks or maximized the stacks of his skills. Now in order for you to do that, you want to be tanky on the first few seconds of the fight. That's why for me, Tranquil Water is a pretty important ring for this March. So this is actually, I think, the best option for this March. Now, is there a budget meal for this one? So for sure there is. There is going to be a budget meal for this one. Okay, another budget meal for this is you can also use the Ring of Serpent. Yes, I know. Ring of Serpent again. Yes, Ring of Serpent. But there is also other options. I think there is a ring that actually deals a strategy damage. This ring, if you want a budget ring, the Ring of Rose deals strategy damage to the enemy troop. You have this damage, 125 plus strategy bonus. Now this is a budget ring. I'm not saying this is going to be revolutionary, because this is a budget ring. I'm just giving you guys option if you want to. So next to Serpent Ring, this is the next ring that you can have, the Ring of Rose for your St. Louis. So it's like a weaker version of an Azure Moon Ring, because it functions almost the same. They only do have a huge difference when it comes to the damage. And although the Azure Moon Ring, you can also get the Azure Moon Ring for only like 10 levels, because this is just 1,600 Jeweler's Mark in the store. Now for the Everflamewing rings, As I've said, you can do the adornments that has burn and silence effect, but the thing is you're going to sacrifice an adornment slot. But if you really can't go with the Everflamewing rings, I think the second next viable option for you here is to actually, let's say, use the Ring of Deer. Ring of Deer really is also good in here to actually bump up your damage. But as I've said, this is going to be now pretty damn squishy. But that is actually also an option that I want you to consider. This is a ring that I don't want you to change. I know that a player will always have a Trunkle ring on him on this march. So now the question is, what if you don't have a Confucius, right? We don't have a Confucius. What's the other troops or what's the other hero that we can use? So if you don't have a Confucius, of course, you have Zhugliang. Now, what if we don't have a Zhugliang? Same rings. Almost make sure you have the same rings, okay? So same rings. What if we don't have a Zhugliang? What else should we use? So you can also use here a Charlemagne, but you are going to be super squishy. Super squishy. So this is the least that I can give you, Charlemagne. So next one is Theodora. If you don't have Confucius or Zhugliang, go for Theodora. It will not perform the same, but it will be there. You will be tanky. Just make sure you are tanky enough, and then you can use the Ring of Falcon in here. And same as with Zhugliang, you can use the Ring of Falcon and also, sorry, Confucius. So you can use the Ring of Falcon there to be tanky. Now another option, if you can afford, you can use the Ring of Skyward Knight also to have more activations for your St. Louis. So that's actually your St. Louis. Also, the Egyptian Chariot is pretty damn cool. You don't really need to do it. So overall, your St. Louis with your Archer can actually have another march here with removing Suleiman. So Suleiman can actually be there, but he can actually also be out. Another one that you can add here in order for you to get a huge performance boost from your St. Louis is actually Charlemagne. So having your Charlemagne here is pretty good also for your St. Louis, especially with Zhugliang because of the damage. Now, as I've said, this one though is going to be a little bit different when it comes to the rings. So for the rings here, you can still use the Azure Moon here, but for me, I think Everflamewing rings is a ring that I want here because of the additional extra damage taken by your troop or your enemy troop. And then use this one again. And another one is, since you are already tanky with all of that, use your Skyward Knight. So this is, I think, going to be a pretty much viable troop for the spenders. Now for the budget rings, same as before, you change your Everflamewing rings to your Ring of Serpent, or as I've said earlier, Ring of Azure Moon, or if not, if you don't have that, go for your Ring of Rose. Now for your Charlemagne, it's either this or your Tranquil Water. So if you don't have that and you want another one, I think the best viable option here is still to have a Skyward Knight. So I think that's the one you don't want to change, but rather either you want to get your hands on the Tranquil Water here and just give it like low levels, and then if you really can't go for the Skyward Knight, you can actually get your hands on the Falcon Ring also. As I've said earlier, your Falcon Ring will really give you a lot on this march. Now also another question, can you use the Ring of Crow here? Yes, you can use your Ring of Crow, just give it to Charlemagne, but as long as you are tanky with your Zhugliang, that is actually the most important thing. Now what if we don't have Zhugliang and then use your Theo? Now if you can afford your Confucius, this is what it would look like. It will be the same for the rings as long as your Charlemagne is the second in command. It will be same as the ring, but you will only have to replace the hero. So another option here is Confucius. So if you're going to have a tier, I think the number one tier is this one, the first tier. This is my first tier for this march. Second tier is actually this guy right here, Confucius. This is the second tier, and the third tier is your Theodora here. Now, if you have your Suleiman, I think your first tier also is your Zhugliang, then your Confucius is your next tier, and then your Theodora. There's actually a lot of combinations in here, that's why I'm mentioning every single one. So the next question is it better to have Zhugliang here? Sorry, if it's better to have Suleiman here as your as your build with either of the other heroes, rather than having your Charlemagne here with your other heroes? Is that the option? For me, I will be honest with you guys. I really love Charlemagne here, and with Sugriang. This is actually also another one that I really like. Or this one. This is the second one that I really like. So yeah, these two march, those two march are actually my main priorities if I am going to use Saint Louis. So that's my take on your Saint Louis. And as I've said, this march also with your Charlemagne in replacement of Confucius does slaps. And the main value of this one, don't forget, is not its individual performance one-on-one. No. The main value of this hero here and the main march is actually the incapacitation state AoE of your St. Louis, because it will be really good in the battlefield, especially if your battlefield is cramped with heroes. So you can see all the other heroes in there fighting, and then you can just jump in, and then once your commander skill hits, there will be three possible opponents that can be incapacitated, and in a way will have a hard time. So this is a control first build rather than kill first build. So there's a difference on that one. So if in the field we see St. Louis maybe in the next fights, once the advent is open for the new heroes, I think there will be like a new meta in the open field. The only weakness of this march is actually, let's face it, Lubus. So there's always going to be Lubus. So you must know how to position yourself in the battlefield. Now, next up is actually the next question. Is it going to be better for St. Louis to be here on the archers or in the pikemen? So as I mentioned just now about the Lubu problem, that is actually another thing with this march. So if you go for the pikeman, which is the second route that you will go, the only problem that you're going to face are swordsmen, especially Ramesses users. With the Miyamoto users, we can at least deal a bit of damage, and sometimes we almost can kill a Miyamoto, but if Miyamoto doesn't really activates that much, that's the time. But I think we have a better chance to be on the field with St. Louis and have a better chance of landing the incapacitation state to the other heroes rather than having St. Louis as a damage primary for your main march. So yeah, I think that's the main priority of your St. Louis, is to really hit that commander skill. But still, in the process, you will still have a good chunk of exchanges when it comes to the troops that and also your points and merit. Now let's discuss about the builds that your St. Louis is actually going to work with your pikeman. Now the build that is really on the meta and most content creators like our friend Mr. Sneak and the others are actually using is this build. Well, this build really is very, very good. And honestly speaking, there is some rings here that is actually really you cannot change, like this one. On your Elizabeth though, if you do not have your crushing impact, the other option is your, I know, triple offensive. So this is actually the build that you want to do as your first option, because your St. Louis, as I've said, has a skill that can boost your second in command or second hero damage. So this is actually the build that you want to do. If you cannot do, I think the Everflamewing rings here is actually very important in my opinion. And then on your Elizabeth, I think still the Tranquil Water to be tanky is actually a viable option, especially if there are swords in the field. You need that first block of damage. You need to block all of those damage, so you need to negate that one. That's why for me, Tranquil Water is very important. So does this build has like a budget meal again? Yes, it has. I will say a Ring of Serpents still, because that's the norm, but I think the Ring of Lofty Mountain for your St. Louis is actually good also. If you don't have the Radiant Guardian ring here on your Belisarius, I think it's a bummer that you don't have that. But yeah, for the low spenders, I think you can use other rings. And I think one of the rings that is a possibility here, if you want to really use this March, is actually, where is it? This one. It can actually also help, because this one will reduce the damage from an enemy hero, and then one of your heroes will actually have the damage. The only downside is you don't know which hero will have your damage, but one thing is for sure, you will have a commander's damage increase, which is pretty damn good. in my opinion. And I think that's a good additional ring here for your troops if you are on a budget meal. And as I've said, you have a lofty mountain. You should have that if you don't have the other rings that I mentioned. Now for me, as I've said, Elizabeth, if you can, just make sure that she is a little bit tankier. You can also use a Skyward Knight ring here, which is I think also important for activations, but rather I would rather, for me personally, will have the first instance of the fight to be tanky. So I use Tranquil Water. Now there is a catch to this build. There is a catch against a St. Louis. Whatever your build that you have your St. Louis on, the hero that you must stay away from are like the old Belisarius March, because the old Belisarius March with Ashoka will not be affected by your St. Louis controls. That's the sad part. But as I've said, you must choose your target. So if you have Belisarius, Elizabeth, and Ashoka against a St. Louis is going to be pretty. But and if you are wise enough, of course, your St. Louis is going to thrive in the battlefield. Other players are saying that St. Louis is for rally. Dame, na. I think you are mistaken that St. Louis is going to be just for the rally, like what you did with Belisarius, Elizabeth, and Ashoka. But St. Louis, I will not waste. If I'm a St. Louis user, I will not waste his commander skill in the rally. You know why? Because your commander skill is pretty good. Okay, I think that is the selling point of your St. Louis, his commander skill. For me, it sucks to see a good field fighter with St. Louis who is not actually a good killer, but a pretty much has a skill that is open field worthy. So for me, you have to use that. And having this in the field, I think as tanky as you can actually make this lineup pretty damn solid. And also, besides Belisarius, Elizabeth, and Ashoka, your next best, your next counter, I think, are the heroes with the debuffs cancellation. Like for example, heroes with Immortal Army that can negate this one. There is also another hero that you can use as a support, which is TJG. Now with this March, I think you want to be tanky than damagey, if you know what I mean. But you know what? I have experienced this skill here that is pretty good and I think pretty important. Although this one should be changed once you don't have Elizabeth there. You can change this to Immortal Army with more healing. Now with Peaceful Haven, it will be tankier, but for me, Immortal Army is the second best bet. Because for me, as I've said, I want to use the Tranquil Water here. Then maybe if I don't have an Everflamewing rings here, I can use a Lofty Mountain so I can be tanky. This, if I cannot really get this one, as I've said, Ring of Crow, Ring of Deer, pretty good also. So that's actually one of the damage that you can actually get for this one. Now, Tranquil Water here to be tanky, yes. But the healing here will be insane if you have the Immortal Army plus your signature skill. So I think that's going to be enough. And the combo here is that once you get this one, signature skill, because this is when your commander skill uses signature skill, their customizable skill damage increases by 6%. When their customizable skill as activation, when they uses their customizable skills, the activation of your chance of their signature skill increases. So it actually it rewards each other. So that's why I think DJG is also a pretty good support hero in this March. So yeah, I think it will also work that way. And we have tried it. Although we have better, I will be honest with you, we had better results with Elizabeth here than DJG. We have better results with Elizabeth here than DJG. That's actually the truth. Now, before I go, I have to mention also your Ashoka in this build. Does it work? The thing here is this one. Increases your commander's signature secondary skill strike activation chance, which your hero St. Louis is not. I think this will not work overall because of the secondary strike skill. Although, as I've said, your Ashoka will for sure be asked by a lot of players if you can use an Ashoka with SL. And I think now you know the answer because SL has a active skill-based signature skill. And your Ashoka will not work in this one, even if it's going to be tanky. So the only heroes that Ashoka can actually help in this March is actually Belisarius. So for me, And so not for me, but for everyone, please do not use Ashoka in this build. Although you can use him, but you don't know how much value Ashoka's signature skill really is. So if you're not going to be able to use that, I'm not sure that for me the value of Ashoka is really or can be really used here. So I think that's about it for your St. Louis for archers and for St. Louis for pikemen. And hey, click on this video right here for more awesome TITOBODS content. Thanks for watching, you guys, and TITOBODS out.